many years ago. Good to see everybody. There are more people here than I expected. Tonight I want to talk about the banks of Barren County and some of the earlier ones and on up to the present time. And a lot of the information that I have compiled for this little talk was taken from an article in the Glasgow Daily Times on July the 14th, 1993, and was written by Francis Bastian, apparently as a result of an interview with Richard L. Devers, who's managing editor at the time of the Times-Argus newspaper in Central City, Kentucky. Mr. Devers collects old bank notes, and we've got some here already floating around tonight. They were issued by a local national bank throughout the country, and he states that Barren County has the distinction of having the most chartered national banks of any county in the state of Kentucky, with the exception of Jefferson County and Fayette County, which is Louisville and Lexington. The other information that I will be presenting is coming from my own memory, which is not so good anymore, and also from the memory and records of other local bank officers. The oldest bank, as far as I can tell, in Barren County is H.Y. Davis State Bank, and it was formed in 1889, I think. I'm not quite positive on that, but I think it was. It became a branch of Citizens Bank and Trust Company of Glasgow in 1972. This Mr. Devers that I was telling you about claims that there was a H.Y. Davis National Bank of Cave City, and it was chartered in September 1905 and changed to H.Y. Davis State Bank in July 1917. But I've not found the proof of that. But it's possible that it started out as a state bank and then converted to a national bank and back to a state bank later. I'd be interested to know if anybody has any information on that, to bear that out one way or the other. But some of the people involved in the bank over the years were H.Y. Davis, naturally, Hardin Young Davis, Ernest C. Davis, and Miss Winfred Davis, who was still working at the time of the merger, and Earl Dickey and C.T. Huffines. At the time of the merger with Citizens Bank and Trust Company, Mr. Guy Comer of Nashville, Tennessee, and his interest had control of the bank, I think. The next bank was First National Bank of Glasgow. It was opened and chartered in November 1892 with a capital of $50,000, and it closed April the 15th, 1932. The bank was closed during the Depression, and from all the reports that I have heard and information that I have gotten, this bank should not have been closed. They paid back better than 90%, better than 90 cents on the dollar after the administration costs were paid, which the administrators took over a year to liquidate the bank and wind it up. So their fees was much more than the loss that the depositors had. Well, first to point out, there was no FDIC insurance back at that point, so it was a loss if the bank closed to the depositors. People involved with the bank were A.E. Young, president, W. Basil Smith, cashier, and Hal Ralston, vice president. I'll stop here and tell the story. I would like to tell it later, but I'll probably forget it. Uh, Mr. Whit Downing was cashier and vice president of the Citizens National Bank at the time of the Depression. And during the time that I was there, a customer came in one day and says, I want to tell you a story that the reason why I have banked here all of these years. He said, during the Depression, the Trigg Bank had closed. The feeling in the community was that probably Citizens Bank was the weakest bank in town of the ones that was left. My money was in Citizens Bank, and I decided I was going to take it over to First National. So he came to the bank and found out how much money he had, went to First National and wrote him a check for his balance. But that night, First National closed. Mr. Downing had word that it was going to close, so when the check came back to Citizens the next morning, he sent it back in sufficient funds. And he saved me my bank account, so I will always bank with Citizens. So that's a good story to tell. The next bank in the county was the People's State Bank of Cave City. It was chartered in 1897 and became a branch of New Farmers Bank in 1979. People involved with the bank in later years were Hampton and Leron Reynolds, and people involved earlier were S.D. Caldwell, cashier, George Smith, father of Floyd Smith, who was president of Horse Cave State Bank many years, and E. Dickey. I think it's interesting that I believe it's a brother of S.D. Caldwell went to Mumfordville and opened that bank up there. And Mr. Smith, of course, was at the Horse Cave Bank for, Mr. Floyd Smith was president of Horse Cave State Bank for many years. All right, we're up to 1900, and the Trigg National Bank opened in July 1900 with a capital of $50,000, and it closed January 28th, 1932. The Great Depression got this bank also. The people involved with it were Hayden Trigg, the founder, Thomas P. Dickinson, who was Mr. Trigg's son-in-law, was president, and Alanson Trigg, who was Mr. Hayden Trigg's son, was a cashier. So it was a family. Most of these banks were family banks at that point. July of 1903, July seems to be a good month, the Third National Bank opened with a capital of $25,000. And it merged with the Farmers State Bank to form Farmers National Bank in April 1910. The people involved with the bank were Samuel T. Young, president, Asa D. Young, cashier, and W.J. Davidson, vice president. Phelan Jewel Bowles became president in 1908 and continued to be a very prominent banker, as most of you know, until his death in 1954. In November 1906, the Citizens National Bank of Glasgow was chartered with a capital of $40,000. People involved in the bank in the early days were James P. Depp, president, and Ralph Kennard, cashier. Other presidents to follow were George J. Ellis and Wynn Davis. And as I mentioned, L.W. Downing was cashier and vice president and chief operating officer for many years. In 1963, the bank gave up its national charter and became Citizens Bank and Trust Company of Glasgow, a state bank. Linville Hall was president, and he was followed by George J. Ellis Jr., James Trigg Pace, and Harold Matthews. In 1991, the bank became a branch of Trends Financial Bancorp of Bowling Green. Since then, the bank has become Star Bank, First Bank, and finally U.S. Bank. In 1908, Park City State Bank was formed. People involved in the bank for many years were H.L. Joe Perkins, president and cashier, Comer Denton, chairman, H.E. Arterburn, vice chairman, J.L. Brown, vice president, Jewel Colliver, vice president, and G.B. Hanson, vice president. The bank was bought by James K. Bale in the mid-'80s and branched into Glasgow in 1985, I believe, just outside the city limits. In 1988, the bank became the South Central Bank of Barren County, and in 1989 it moved to its present location in downtown Glasgow. Let me tell you a little of the story on the branching. The law at that point was that if you wanted to put a branch in a town like Glasgow in the city limits, you couldn't do it, but you could buy a bank inside the city limits and use it as your main office or maybe even a branch. But this branch was opened down south of town at Pritchardsville, right on the edge of the city limits. And shortly thereafter, there was movement. Now, I'd already retired, so I don't know who was back of it or anything of that nature, but there was a movement to take a piece of ground down in there and incorporate it into the city limits. And that piece of ground was large enough to include the branch. And when they got the branch inside the city limits, then they could go where they wanted to, and they came downtown and took the old First Federal building. And that was a good move on their part. The Hiceville Deposit Bank was chartered in 1903. The first meeting of the directors was held in September 1903, and the people involved in the bank were J.T. Winlock, president, E.S. Edwards, vice president, W.V. Leathers, cashier until 1916, L.B. Strader, J.Y. Wood, S.G. Hatcher, T.B. Terry, G.B. Edwards, L.W. Lacey, W.D. and G.E. Goff, J.K. Skaggs, W.G. Maggard, and from 1916 until 1948, Mr. R.H. Nunn was the cashier, and in 1948, Sam Terry became the cashier and remained the chief operating officer and cashier, and maybe a higher title, I'm not sure, until his death in 1975. The bank was merged with New Farmers National Bank in 1976. The Farmers National Bank of Glasgow was a charter April 1910 with capital of $75,000. As already mentioned, this bank was formed by merging the Third National Bank and the Farmers State Bank. Phelan Jewel Bowles was president and Paul Holman was cashier for many years. Because of the Depression, the bank had to be reorganized in December 1932. It then became New Farmers National Bank with W.P. Combs as president and E.H. Guthrie as cashier. Capital at that point was $100,000. Mr. G.H. Fant was a vice president of that reorganization. He was a merchant on the square in Glasgow. I don't know exactly where or what type of merchant he had, but he was already retired when I went to work at the bank, and I don't know. But he played a big part of raising this capital, and which went to the hip and keep the bank open. A short time after the reorganization, Mr. Bowles became president of the bank again. Well, first time for New Farmers, but he had been president of the old bank. and remained president until his death in 1954. Rogers Dickinson followed E.H. Guthrie as cashier and also died in 1954. At his death, Rogers' death, L. Felix Murray was brought in the bank as executive vice president, and James Trigg Pace became cashier. Sam Sears had been named president on the death of Mr. Bowles earlier. Other presidents to follow were L. Felix Murray, S. James Aldridge, and William W. James. The bank later became a branch of Area Bank Shares and still later a branch of BB&T. The last bank that was chartered was Citizens Financial Bank. It was chartered in July 2001, and the capital approximately $5 million. The capital requirements have been increased tremendously over this period of time. About the time I retired 20 years ago, the state had raised the requirement from $1 million to $2 million, and now, a couple of years ago, they wanted it up around $5 million. Henry Dickinson is chairman of this bank, and Terry Bunnell is president, and we have several other staff members. Nancy Hale is president. Larry Ramey is also there. Sheila Bunch, Anise Bishop, Sue Roach, Donnie Kirby, Jeff Constant, Judy Risley, Charlotte Humphrey, Janice Botts, Jennifer Haskins, and Jordan Spillman. A lot of these have worked in other banks in town, and I believe there are 4 that I hired in the years past. I've got a bad name for hiring people. This, I believe, is the first bank charter in Glasgow since National Bank was formed in 1906. Other banks in Glasgow, first is Edmonton State Bank, who moved its home office to Glasgow from Edmonton in 1997, and then into their new building in 1998. Now, again, we get back to the banking laws of the state. It became, right in this period of time, first time it'd be able to cross county lines and do banking. But to come into Barren County like Edmonton State Bank did, they had to move their main office to Glasgow, and if they could do that, then they could keep the office in Edmonton as a branch. And that's what these 3 banks did, as I understand it. Kentucky Banking Center moved its home office to Glasgow from Horse Cave, again in 1997, and into their new building in 1998. United Community Bank moved the home office to Glasgow from Marylebone in 1998 after having had a loan production office in Glasgow for a few years. Now, there's several things when you, I guess, do research. You answer one question, but you create more questions about something else. And I've got 5 different questions that came up as I guess I'm a lot older than I think I am, but 1889, if that's the oldest bank in the county, that bank wasn't all that old when I was born. It was about 30 years old. And you ladies been celebrating this week the right to vote. And your right to vote only came 2 weeks before I was born. So I didn't realize how short a time it was, but of all these things that's happening just before I was born. The question also arose in my mind, why were there so many banks organized around this period of 1900. H.Y. Davis in 89, First National Bank 1892, People's State Bank 1897, Trigg National 1900, Third National Bank 1903, Heisville 1903, Citizens 1906, Park City 1908, Farmers National 1910. And then it stopped. The Depression may have had something to do with it stopping. Then the question of why so much activity around the year 2000. And I think that, again, was a change in banking laws, as I have already mentioned. And then a bigger question, and I hope there's somebody here that might know this, was there a second national bank? We had a First National and we had a Third National. No second.
No second.
Okay, I sure didn't know it if there was. I couldn't find out. Most of you, I guess, know where the Third National Bank was. It's kitty corner. There's painting it right now, and that Third National is still up there. Somebody asked an old fellow several years ago, how did you get in the banking business? And he said, well, it was during the Depression, and the bank closed, and I put my little grocery store in it. I bought the building, put my grocery store in it, but the sign was still on the door. And this man walked in and said, I want to make a deposit. So I took his money and gave him a receipt, and things took off from there. I have a few artifacts that I want to pass around, and this is a $10 bill that's issued by the Farmers National Bank of Glasgow. Just take a look at that and pass it around if you would like. The banks put up money or bought bonds, and the Federal Reserve held those. Well, that wouldn't be right. The Treasurer held those securities to back the issuance of these certificates. The one story that I have read as to why this was done, because of the Civil War, the Confederacy money, of course, went not worth the Continental, not worth anything, and people did not trust paper money. And the federal government felt like that if they could issue it through a local bank with the names of the president and the cashiers on that certificate, people would accept it a whole lot easier. And that perhaps was true. But the word national currency on there tells you what kind of money it is. After then, you had gold certificates that were issued, which you could turn them in for gold, supposedly at any time. And then later on, silver certificates. And the gold, we went off the gold standard at the Depression in 32 or 33, I guess. And it was even illegal to own gold for a while. Then your silver certificate, you were supposed to be able to turn that in for silver if you decided to. The money that you have now, I think, carries the name Federal Reserve Bank, or Federal Reserve Note. And any of you know what that's backed by, well, let me know. Over that seal on that note appears, again, in pretty fine letters, redeemable in lawful money of the United States at the United States Treasury or at the bank of issue. On the back of the certificate, there's nothing of any local interest on it that I am aware of. We've got a man back here that his hobby, like Mr. Devers, is collecting these things. You got anything to add to?
Well, I know Mr. Devers. And
do you?
I've been acquainted with him several years, and he has tried to buy mine, and I won't sell it to him.
Why don't you buy his?
Oh, he's got a lot more than I have.
I think he's got quite a few, and he has called me numerous times trying to find out somebody that had some, and I've never been able to tell him of anybody. But, the next thing that I have is a note that somebody brought in and gave me while I was at Citizens. But this note is on the Trigg National Bank, or to the Trigg National Bank of Glasgow. It's March the 13th, 1925, $350, 1 year after date, to be paid to the Trigg National Bank. Rate of interest, and the blank on that is just marked through. It doesn't give the rate of interest, but it draws interest from maturity. Well, this tells me that they took the interest out of the $350 and no more interest was due on it, but the $350 was due. On the back of this, up in the corner, appears in pencil 28, written like $28 and no dollar sign, but that would be the interest on $350 at 8%. I'm assuming that's what it is. Down at the bottom at the due date, which is March the 13th, 1926, March has been marked through with a pencil and June has been there. So the note was evidently, or a portion of it, renewed for 3 months. Again, on the back it says the interest paid to June the 13th, 1926. So they collected the interest there for that 3 months. At the lower bottom of it, there's a figure appears 150 and another one 200, and they got big numbers by the side of that. I'm thinking that means he either paid $150 when it came somewhere along the line, or he paid $200. He made 2 payments out of it, is the way I read it. And this note has a picture, and I don't know who that picture might be, but I believe I would. I thought it might be interesting to tell you a little bit about my banking, starting from the time I was about 9.5 years old. I had a bank account. This is the first check that I ever So one year, I always, from a little boy, helped him on the farm. He gave me a little spot of tobacco and said that was my tobacco. If I would work and help him, and I'll help you, and we'll work together, but this will be yours. Well, the fact that it was mine made it much more interesting. And we sold that tobacco. He kept it separated. And I had $50. So I deposited $50 in the bank. Then he said, you need to get a calf. And you have to kind of grow your money. You can't raise it all in tobacco. And we've got 4 calves out here, and you can take your choice. I've got one of them was a little heifer calf, and she was real nice. And he said, I want $30 for her. And then he had 3 steers. One of those were pretty nice, and you can have that one for 25. The next one wasn't quite so good, 20, and then there was one pretty sorry, and you can have that one for 15. Now, he made no sales pitch, which one you ought to take, this one or that one, which I probably would have done, but he left it up to me entirely. Well, I figured those 3 steers weren't going to have many calves or give much milk. So I took the highest priced one, the $30 one. Then he sets me down with, helped me write the check, and he said, now you got to stub it. And this check, as you will see, is torn off. The stub was over here on the end of it. And I put down the deposit, subtracted my $30, and all at once it hit me. I had $50, now I've only got 20. And I looked up and I said, it gets away fast, doesn't it? And he had a little grin on his face, but I didn't know what that grin meant until years later, because that's what he wanted me to find out, how quick it could get away. And this check, one thing that's interesting on it, you might want to look, you can hold it up to the light, and it's perforated, paid February the 18th, 1930. It's dated February the 10th. I guess I had a little, what do you call it there, Terry? Float. Had a little float time on. While we're passing those around, I thought it might be interesting to tell you how I got in the banking business. I went to high school, and shortly after I started high school, I thought I would become a lawyer. My mother and my grandmother didn't like that idea, and they wanted me to be a doctor. Well, I'd gone to the doctor once with a pink eye, and Dr. Weldon laid me down on the table, and he took both thumbs and rubbed my eyes with medicine in it, and then we started out of the office, and this was, you know where Cecil Wilson law office was, up those steps, going up stairs. I guess law office still there. And I got top of those steps and fainted. And I rolled down the whole steps and landed on the sidewalk. And my father was with me. And but I was ahead of him, so it wasn't what the thing he could do. And he says that a big 200-pound fella picked me up and came right back up the steps with me to the office, and they took me in, resuscitated me, and I said, I can't take a doctor's office because I'll get sick. And of course, they assured me I wouldn't, but anyway, I didn't. But the year I was a senior, which is 1939, now remember, the Depression, people lost all faith and trust in banks. And the Kentucky Bankers Association sponsored an oratorical contest for high school seniors, primarily to try to get a better name, I think, for banks, and they would get a local bank to co-sponsor in their county. And New Farmers, by the way, that check you'll notice is on Farmers, not New Farmers. It's 1930. It was New Farmers in 39, and they helped sponsor that contest. Virginia Akers Downing, most of you know, J.C.'s wife, took first place in that contest, and I took second place. We both go on to school, and I don't know Virginia's schooling, how long or when she went to the bank, but I went on to college and taught school 1 year, and then went into the Army, and it came out of the, well, first I wound up in a bomb group in England as a navigator on a B-24 bomber. I flew 27 combat missions, and in November of 44, our whole unit was pulled out and brought back to the States for B-29 training. But on the between the time that we landed in the States and the reporting date, I had 30-day leave at home. So I was at home in December 44. My father was going to town one day, and he said, you want to go with me to town? I've got to go, and I got to go by the bank a few minutes. And it was during the time of the Battle of the Bulge, and I was listening every minute nearly that I could on getting the news as to what was happening there. And I told him, I don't guess so. I haven't got any reason to go. And he says, come on and go with me, because Mr. Bowles is already asking about you, and I want him to see you. You haven't seen him for a while. And I said, I don't know Mr. Bowles. I know Mr. Sears. I know Mr. Dickinson. I know the women in there, but I don't know Mr. Guthrie, but I don't know Mr. Bowles. Mr. Bowles was a quiet type of fellow that you didn't know him. He wasn't, if you weren't around him. He didn't attract a lot of attention. So I went with him, and Father introduced me to him, and Mr. Bowles was pleasant enough, but I read right quickly, he just assumed I'd go on as to be taking up his time. That's kind of the way I felt about it. So we left, nothing said about it. But we go on, and I get out of the service, and no intention of doing anything other than going back to school. But school had already started in September, so I couldn't go till January. Well, the superintendent of schools called me and said, I've got a vacancy out at Hiceville. I need you to fill that out the rest of the term. So I thought, well, I might as well do that. That's going to make me next fall before I go to school, but I guess that'll be all right. I need to be doing something. So I went out and finished that school. Got two characters on the front row here. her sister went to school to me. W.S. Everett went to school to me. And I came to the bank one Saturday. I was in the teller's line to get a check cashed, I guess, or make a deposit. And Mr. Bowles walked up to the side of me and says, "When you get through here, I want to talk to you." Well, I couldn't figure out what I had done. That's the first thought that I had. Something's wrong here. And I go in his office, and he says, "James, I've been watching you ever since that speech contest. I want you to come to work for me." And I was strictly amazed. And that's what I decided to do, and it made my mother happy and my grandmother happy, and too. The only other, whether you call this an artifact or not, but you have ideas. This is not my idea. I guess it was a checkbook company's idea, was to take a check and but nobody seemed to want to do that. So I've still got a sample there that I didn't use. I guess if you were to ask me some of the things that you feel like that you have done over the years, I still get people that will come up to me and say, "You loaned me the first money I ever had," and that's a good feeling. And they say, "Do you remember that?" And I said, "Well, no, I don't, because you paid me." I remember some of those that you didn't pay, and it does make a difference. But if I've been successful, I feel like it has been in the hiring of people. There's one time here, not long ago, I think, we had Harold Matthews, Tommy Jackson, and Tommy Jackson introduced me to Terry Bunnell, running 3 banks here in town at the same time. And that makes you feel good when you have selected somebody with that much capability. It's Mr. Bowles. I've thought a lot of times how long he watched me before of course, he didn't have an opportunity to hire me part of that time, but he still watched. And I have always tried, when I was in the bank, my major positions, try to have in mind somebody either inside the bank or somebody outside, in case something happened to that individual, that I could go get and see if I could fill that spot. That concludes my remarks. I will be glad for any questions that you might have, if anybody's got any.
Back in the early 30s, in the bigger cities, they had something called the float. Are you familiar with that?
The float? Well, that's what I asked Terry about. That's the time between your writing the check and it hitting the bank.
And a lot of times that was used to, when I got my first job, first thing my boss did was take me down as a teenager and start a bank account for me, because he was working it. You could gain 3 or 4 days maybe on each transaction, so you could get enough cash to fill in a bum check, was basically what it was.
Yeah. I didn't know it was that old, but it's been worked a long time by many people.
It is hard to do now with the instantaneous.
Yeah, it's much harder to do now, but I'd say it's still getting done. We had one of our national businesses came to town. We had their checking account, had all kinds of money in the bank, again, paper money. And we had a big snow, and the town was shut down here for about 3 days. And all at once, this account was overdrawn. And I said, what in the world? And I got to checking. They were writing drafts on this account from California. Well, it took it a week to get here. And they were anticipating their deposits that they were going to have. When that snow came, it didn't have it. So we put a stop to that.
Mr. Place, you mentioned national banks and state bank charters. What are the advantages of one over the other?
I don't know if there's that much advantage one way or the other. Smaller bank, it's probably more advantageous to be a state bank because of if you're a national bank, you have to be a member of the Federal Reserve. Terry, don't let me get off base here. And you've got to keep money with the Federal Reserve, a certain percentage, right? Is that still true?
Right, and then the national banks are overseen by the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and they're still regulated by the FDIC. If you're a state bank, you don't have the OCC, you have the state banking institution in Kentucky, then the FDIC.
So you're a national bank if you have banks in more than one state, is the reason you would want to be one?
But not necessarily. That helps in some degree because you have a common regulator. Like if you were in Kentucky and Tennessee, and you're a state bank, you're dealing with two different entities. In the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions and the Tennessee, you're a national bank and you have the OCC and the FDIC, which would be national regulators.
You've got to remember that I've been out of the banking business for 20 years, and that scares me too when I start to answer a question that's a relatively easy question ordinarily, but there have been tremendous amount of changes. Somebody said that recently, banking's changed since you were in it, and I said, yeah, I don't even know what a fax machine is. But thank you for your attention.
Have you or a loved one participated in a local event filmed by the Glasgow EPB? Maybe it was a school graduation, Little League championship, or a musical performance. These are all events that have recently been professionally captured on video by the EPB to be aired on Channel 6. The EPB archives contain community, school, and church events dating back to 1990 and can be purchased by anyone. DVDs are $13 and would make a great gift for family and friends while preserving a timeless memory of a special moment in one's life. Call to place your order today.